They said it was only a feather, soft silver gray, and no longer bound to the bird that bore it. But in the right hands, it remembered roads long vanished and songs never written down. No map could follow its trail, and no name ever stayed with the man who held it. Only the stories did. Like and subscribe for more stories from Drowsy Archives. Beyond the low hills and winding brooks of the eastern provinces, there lay a stretch of quiet river towns. Small places where shutters creaked softly in the breeze and children floated paper boats across slow, shallow waters. Life moved gently in these towns, as if time itself had agreed to walk a little slower here. Bakers rose before dawn, firewood was stacked with care, and nothing ever changed too quickly. And yet people spoke of a sound, one that did not quite belong to the river or the breeze. It came and went, like birdsong too distant to trace. Some said it was a melody caught in the trees. Others thought it was the sound of a flute drifting from the hills. But most agreed, it was a song that never seemed to start or end. The elders remembered it best. They would sit on porches or near open windows, nodding quietly when it returned. "The bard has passed again," they would murmur. And though no one ever saw him come or go, there were always small signs left behind. A sprig of dried lavender on a windowsill. A coin balanced on its edge beside the town well. A piece of parchment fluttering from a nail on the door of the bakery. Words scrawled in gentle ink. "Your bread reminds the sky of warmth." No name signed at the bottom. Just the note. Just the feeling it left behind. In Bramblewick, a river town lined with crooked stone bridges, a girl once followed the sound. She wandered beyond the orchards and into the grass, bare feet silent beneath her hem. She did not find a man, but she found a feather, silver gray, resting on a flat stone as if placed there purposefully. She took it home and placed it beside her bed. That night, she dreamt of an old road winding through mist, and someone walking it with a lute slung across his back. Other towns shared their own versions. A farmer in Elrose found a tune scratched into his barn wall. Not carved, just written in faint lines of gray ink. He played it on his old fiddle, and the cows quieted at once, as if they too had heard it long ago. In Fairmere, a merchant opened a crate and found a folded page tucked beneath the wool. No order list, no numbers. Just a single line. Even the quiet things want to be remembered. The river towns never asked for stories. They lived in the spaces between them. But the bard gave them what they did not know they had lost. A melody without words, carried on wind, etched not in stone but in air. And when the people looked across the river at dusk and heard that faint, floating note, they did not chase it. They listened. No one ever remembered his name. Not because it was secret, but because he had let it go long ago, like a page torn gently from a book and released into the wind. The bard traveled from village to village, town to town, yet no ledger ever recorded him, and no innkeeper could recall what he had called himself. But everyone remembered what he left behind. He carried no banner. His cloak was simple, worn soft by weather and time. A deep river-blue wool with frayed edges, stitched with patience, not pride. His boots bore the dust of many provinces, and the satchel at his side looked as though it had been repaired more times than any one stitch could show. But most of all, there was his instrument, an old wooden lute, polished not by oil but by the memory of countless hands holding it gently. And then there was the quill. Tucked into a narrow slot in his satchel, the feather quill was unmistakable. A shade of silver gray, so soft it looked like mist trapped in shape. It was not flashy. No gemstone. No ornate holder. But it shimmered faintly when firelight touched it, and it never seemed to gather dust. People said he wrote with it when no one watched. Not letters, not stories. Just fragments. Notes that sounded more like dreams than songs. Words that seemed to belong to everyone and no one. He never stayed long. A night, perhaps two. Sometimes not even that. He would sit beneath an old tree or near the corner of a well-traveled road and begin to hum. Softly at first, then louder as the rhythm found him. Children would gather near, seated on stones or packed soil. Travelers would stop walking. Even horses would pause and lower their heads. And still he never spoke his name. He would sing old tales, but not quite the way others told them. He had a way of changing the endings. Not to make them happy or sad, but to make them feel inevitable. As though they had always been meant to be heard this way. People would cry without knowing why. They would laugh at quiet lines that seemed written just for them. And when he left, it always felt a little too soon. But he always left something. A note tucked into a stable door. A line of music sketched in dirt with the heel of his boot. a humming breeze that lingered after his steps had vanished. No one could remember his name, but they remembered the way the world felt different for a little while after he had passed. He was not a ghost. He was not a legend. He was simply a bard, a man with no name, but more notes than most hearts could hold. The feather was unlike any other. Long, smooth, and tinted the softest shade of silver gray, as if twilight had been plucked from the sky and given form. It was not bright like polished metal, nor dull like ash. It shimmered gently, like morning fog catching the edge of dawn. Some said it once belonged to a heron that flew across forgotten kingdoms. Others claimed it had fallen from the sky during a storm that left no rain, only silence. The bard never told the truth of it. He kept it close, wrapped in cloth inside the narrow pocket of his satchel. Only when he was truly alone, beneath a leaning pine, beside a forgotten stone, or in the corner of a windowless room, would he unwrap it. And then, with quiet ceremony, he would dip the feather into a small bottle of gray ink, uncorked only on such occasions. The ink had no scent, no shine, and yet it never ran dry. What he wrote was never for others to see. Not entirely. Some pages he folded and left behind, tucked beneath candles, between loose floorboards or inside hollow trees. Others he burned once the ink had dried, as if their words were meant only for a single moment of existence before turning to ash. But there were also those few writings that remained with him, small, weathered pages bound by a thread so thin it seemed like it might vanish at any touch. On them were not full songs or stories. Just beginnings. Just memories. Fragments. She waited at the bridge, even after the river forgot her name. Not every road leads home, but all of them carry something there. The wind has hands. It holds more than people think. No one saw him write these words, and yet people across the provinces whispered about them. They had found them in strange places. Carved into old trees, etched in soot on the inside of chimney stones, scratched faintly into the wooden sides of barrels floating downstream. Words that sounded like they had always existed, but had only just been found. The feather seemed to know things the bard did not yet remember. It was not magic, not in the way old tales speak of spells and charms. But there was something ancient about it, something patient, as if it had been waiting for the right hand to hold it, not to command it, but to listen to it, to follow where it pointed rather than force it to write. And the bard listened. When others sought fame through song, he sought meaning through silence. When others wanted applause, he welcomed quiet. Because the feather did not respond to pride. It responded to stillness. And in stillness the quill moved. Not always fast. Not always clear. But with certainty. Every mark it left was light, as though written on air rather than parchment. Yet those marks never faded. Ink vanishes. But meaning does not. The roads between towns were not straight. They curled like old handwriting, shaped by hills and history. Stones poked through the dirt in some places, while moss softened the path in others. Caravans passed often enough to leave ruts, but seldom enough that silence still ruled the space between hoofbeats. The bard walked these roads without urgency. He never rode a horse, never joined a caravan, and rarely traveled with another soul. He moved at the pace of thought, unhurried, reflective, in rhythm with his own quiet breath. Inns dotted the roadways like lanterns in a long hallway. Some were grand, boasting polished tables, loud laughter, and roaring fires. Others were quiet and crooked, where wind whistled through the walls and the hearth had not been lit in days. He did not choose based on comfort. He chose based on sound. If a place hummed softly with distant voices and fire crackles, he stayed. If it rang too loud with pride or gold, he passed. The innkeepers never remembered his name, but always remembered his presence. In the blue willow and near Frostmere, he left behind a single note on a napkin. You cook stew the way stars dream of warmth. In the hollow tankard by the roadside in Marlfen, he played a tune so gentle it made the rowdiest men fall silent without shame. No one clapped when he finished. They only nodded, as if they had just remembered something important from long ago. The bard never asked for coin, but he never went hungry. A slice of bread appeared beside his elbow. A folded blanket left at the foot of his bed. A room unlocked. A door left slightly ajar. And always there were the listeners. They came not for entertainment, but for recognition. Something in the bard's presence made people feel that they had been quietly understood. He never stared, yet he saw. He never asked, yet he knew what a person carried just behind the eyes. Children crept close, eyes wide with curiosity. Elderly folk leaned against the wall, eyes closed, mouths softly mouthing words they thought they had forgotten. Travelers left their chairs turned slightly toward the fire, just in case he returned to that same spot one day. He listened more than he spoke. He observed more than he judged. And when he sang, it was not to impress, but to release. He gave shape to silence and let the silence return when the song was done. Sometimes he left behind a fragment of verse, scribbled with the feather quill and pinned to a post. If your heart is tired, rest it where stories sleep. No signature, just the ink, the silence, and the door left swinging in the wind behind him. Ferndale was unlike the other towns. It sat low in a hollow, tucked between mossy ridges and whispering trees. The roads into it narrowed into quiet paths, and the air always smelled faintly of pine needles and wood smoke. But what made Ferndale truly strange, what gave it a place in the bard's quiet journey, were the lanterns. They hung from every post, every porch, and every crooked branch. Not grand ones, not uniform. Some were made of colored glass, others of bent tin and river stone. Each flickered differently, blue, gold, green. But they all shared one trait. They never went out. Even when no one lit them. Even when storms blew through or the snow came early. Locals did not question the lanterns. They lit them out of habit, nodded when they flickered without cause, and called them the breath of the hill. Children were told stories of lantern spirits, of night watchers and old protectors. But no one knew for certain where the tradition had started. When the bard arrived in Ferndale, it was autumn. Leaves drifted in spirals, and the lanterns burned with their usual stubborn glow. He walked beneath them slowly, letting his fingers trail just below their swaying glass. No song came to his lips yet. He only listened, to the wind through the shutters, to the distant cough of a chimney, to the hush between footsteps. That night, he played in the courtyard of the old stone inn, beneath a twisted iron arch hung with 7 lanterns that burned pale blue. No one announced him. No chair was offered. Still, the townsfolk came, quietly, gently, without fanfare. They brought no applause, only silence. They sat on steps, leaned on walls, rested against barrels, and let the sound gather like fog. He sang of stillness, of waiting, of homes that do not ask questions when you return. His voice matched the flicker of the lanterns, soft, uncertain, but always present. And when he finished, he did not bow. He simply placed the lute beside him and waited. One by one, the people stood and left, nodding in thanks without speaking. And as they departed, the lanterns around the square shifted. The blue faded into silver. Just for a moment. Just long enough for those still watching to wonder if they had imagined it. In the morning, the bard was gone. But on the iron arch, above the courtyard, a single feather had been tied with a thread of twine. It moved gently in the breeze, brushing against the nearest lantern. Beside the inn's door, a note had been pinned with a wooden toothpick. Wherever the light waits, I will walk slow enough to find it. The townsfolk did not remove it. Not for many seasons. And when newcomers asked about the feather, no one explained. They only pointed at the lanterns and said, "Sometimes light burns for someone long after they leave." It was not the feather that held the mystery. It was the ink. Carried in a small, rounded bottle, dark and worn smooth from years of travel, the ink was never opened in public. The cork had grown soft from use, and a faint thread of wax sealed it each night, though no heat had ever been seen near it. When shaken, it did not slosh. It moved like oil, like memory, thick and slow, as though it had seen too many years to be in a hurry now. The bard never refilled it. He would sit in the dim corners of inns, or beneath trees whose roots tangled like old stories, and he would unstopper the bottle as quietly as one lifts the edge of a sleeping thought. He dipped the feather with a kind of reverence, not as a writer, but as someone seeking permission. Then he would write, on parchment, on bark, on old pages torn from forgotten ledgers. The ink whispered, not aloud, not in words, but in the way it curved along the page, in the way it soaked in and shimmered faintly before drying into a soft gray tone. It looked alive. Not restless, but watchful, as if it chose where it wished to go. He once left behind a note in the village of Renmore that read, "Some ink is made of crushed berries and stone dust. Mine is made of hush and remembering." No one knew what that meant. A scholar who once found one of the bard's discarded pages tried to study the ink. He placed it under candlelight, under sunlight, even over boiling water. But no matter the method, the words faded each time someone tried to translate them too logically. Yet when he stopped, when he simply read the lines aloud without questioning them, the words came back, clearer than before. The bard did not label the bottle. It had no name. He did not trade it, guard it, or speak of its origin. But wherever he went, the words he left behind took on a life of their own. They did not just sit on the page. They lingered in the air. People who read them once would recite them again weeks later, as if they had always known them. Children claimed the bottle whispered when no one touched it, that it hummed when near water, that it glowed faintly when the moon was highest. Of course, most dismissed this as imagination. But those who heard the bard's songs, who stood in the shadow of his silence, who watched the quill move in time with breath and pause, knew better. It was not the ink that whispered. It was the things it remembered. And the bard, whether he knew it or not, was only ever borrowing those memories, letting them pass through his hand, through feather, through page, before vanishing again, like a melody just out of reach. It was bound to happen. Even the most well-walked road has a stone that makes the foot falter. One night, somewhere between the hills of sable green and the old forest that brushed the northern edge of the map, the bard stopped playing. Not because his strings had snapped, not because his voice had faded, but because the tune had simply gone. It vanished like mist, slipping through the fingers of memory. He sat beneath a lone birch tree, his lute resting across his knees, and for the first time in many winters, no song rose to meet the silence. He strummed a few gentle notes, familiar chords, but the melody, the quiet current that usually came without bidding, refused to arrive. The feather quill, resting nearby on the stone beside him, looked still. Not waiting, just still. He tried to write. He uncorked the ink bottle and dipped the quill carefully. But nothing came. Not a line, not a verse, not even one of the cryptic fragments he so often left behind for others to find. The page before him remained blank. And the ink, so patient for so long, sat heavy in the quill's point and would not flow. He waited. The wind rustled the tall grass. The stars blinked into view. A fox passed without noticing him. But still, the tune did not return. That night, the bard did not sleep. He wandered slowly along the forest's edge, through brush and bramble, boots soft on damp moss. In his heart, a quiet ache had formed, not panic, not fear, but something deeper. The kind of hollow that comes when something sacred forgets your name. He sat at the edge of a low brook and listened to the water, hoping it would carry back the notes. But it only babbled its own song, one too old to borrow. At dawn, he returned to the tree and sat again. Still silent. Still waiting. But the forest did not offer a song. The quill did not stir. And the bottle remained still. Then a child's voice. From somewhere along the path came soft humming. A girl no older than 10, walking barefoot with a bundle of firewood tied in her shawl. She did not see the bard at first. She only hummed the melody that had once filled inns and lanternlit squares. His melody. She passed him without speaking, but her voice stayed. Closed his eyes. The tune followed her footsteps. It had not vanished. It had merely moved on, wandered ahead of him, passed into other hands, other hearts. It had left him not in cruelty, but in trust. And in that realization, a tear found his cheek. He dipped the quill again. This time the ink flowed. Slowly. Softly. A single line. Even silence carries the memory of music. And beneath the birch tree he smiled. There was a village the bard had always heard of, but never seen. It was not on any map. Not spoken of in inns. Not marked by road signs or milestones. Yet he had heard whispers in the folds of conversation. Quiet references, half-remembered names, stories that trailed off before they ended. A place said to be tucked between a bend in time and a forest that had forgotten its trees. They called it Darrowmere. Some said it only appeared to those who no longer sought it. Others believed it traveled on its own, shifting just beyond the edge of ordinary sight. But every version of the tale agreed on one thing. No one found Darrowmere by accident. The bard did not seek it, not directly. But something, some note in the wind, some forgotten phrase in a dream, pulled him eastward. The roads narrowed. The sky dimmed. Villages became fewer, then none. Until even the trees seemed unsure of where they stood. And then, quite without warning, he arrived. No gate marked the entrance. No stones signaled a boundary. It simply unfolded around him like a story he had already begun. The village was small, silent, and strange in its stillness. Not lifeless, but thoughtful, like it was listening. Houses made of old river stone leaned toward one another, their chimneys unlit but not cold. Doors stood open with no sound behind them. Paths wound through tall grasses that had grown in careful, natural lines. And in the center, a well, covered not by a roof, but by a canopy of hanging cloths, fragments of old songs embroidered in thread too faint to read from afar. The bard stepped closer. He did not knock. He did not call out. He simply sat on the low stone rim of the well and waited. A breeze passed. Then a whisper. Not from a voice. From the quill. It shifted slightly in his satchel, as if reaching for something. He pulled it out gently and, without thinking, uncorked the ink bottle. The ink flowed freely, almost eagerly. The page beneath his hands remained blank for only a breath. Then the quill began to move. Not by itself, but not entirely by his will either. It was as if he and the feather shared a memory neither could name. Words formed. This village does not wish to be remembered. But it will remember you. The bard stopped. His hand trembled. Behind him, the wind rang softly through a set of hanging chimes, small bells made from bone, strung together by vines. He turned, and for the briefest moment, he saw shadows moving between the homes. Not threatening, just watching, listening. He left a page beside the well. He did not look back, and as he crossed the invisible edge of Darrowmere, the village behind him blurred. Not into fog, not into darkness, but into a space his memory could not hold. He could not return. But the feather had written what it needed to. And that was enough. There comes a time when a song must leave its singer. The bard had wandered through kingdoms and cottages, across marshes and mountains, carrying melodies like soft lanterns in the dark. Some songs he crafted himself, carefully stitched from the silence of inns and the sorrow in strangers' eyes. Others he merely caught, like feathers drifting past, written already in the hush of the world. But not all songs are meant to be kept. Some belong to the wind. It happened on a hill not far from the sea, a quiet rise where tall grasses leaned westward and gulls circled overhead without calling. The bard stood with the quill in his hand, a page resting on a smooth stone. He had just finished writing what felt like the end of something. Not a farewell, not a goodbye, but a final note, drawn long and low, like the last breath of a night's story. The feather shimmered in the fading light. The ink, silver gray as always, dried quickly on the page. It read, "Some songs are not lost. They simply go home." He held the page up to the wind, and then, without hesitation, he released it. The parchment did not flutter or tumble. It floated, steadily, confidently, as though carried by invisible fingers. The wind accepted it, not like a thief but like an old friend. It lifted the paper gently, higher and higher, until it passed beyond sight. Until only the memory of movement remained. The bard stood alone on the hilltop, and for the first time in years, he did not feel the weight of the quill in his hand. It had grown lighter. Not empty. Just quiet. He sat down and let the breeze move through his hair, his cloak, his thoughts. The sea whispered in the distance, too far to see but close enough to be felt. And somewhere in the rustle of the grass, in the sighing of the wind, the song he had just written began to return. Not in full, not as it was on the page, but in fragments scattered and soft. He hummed. Not with purpose. Not with intent. Just with breath. Just with being. And the wind sang back. A harmony. A reminder. A promise. For all his wandering, for all his forgotten names and sleepless nights beneath strange skies, the bard had never been alone in the music. The world had always played its part. The rivers had shaped his verses. The lanterns had held his rhythm. The silence had given space to his stories. And now, the wind carried the last of his song to where it needed to go. He smiled, not with joy but with peace. There would be other songs. Not his. Not now. But others would write, and others would listen. And the wind, the wind, it would always know which pages to carry. The feather, once so vivid in the bard's satchel, now rested quietly on the windowsill of a small cottage tucked into the bend of a river. Its silver-gray hue had softened with time, and though it still caught the light in passing moments, it no longer gleamed as it once did. The ink bottle sat beside it, sealed untouched. The last drop had dried weeks ago, leaving only a faint trace on the glass like a shadow of memory. And yet, the cottage was not silent. Inside, a child sat cross-legged on the floor, humming a tune no one had taught her. Her fingers traced invisible notes in the air. Her eyes closed when the melody found her lips. She did not know the name of the bard, nor the origin of the quill. But she knew the story, even if she had never heard it in words. Because stories like his do not end. They settle into cracks between bricks. They hum through rafters at night. They curl into the steam of morning tea and rise with the fog across old hills. They are not remembered in books, but in the feeling they leave behind, in quiet moments, in half-hummed tunes, in the pause before someone dares to speak a truth they have carried for too long. The villagers still speak of him now and then. A note found in a drawer. A tune scratched onto the bottom of a wooden bowl. A single sentence written on a page long buried in the folds of an old blanket chest. You were heard, even if you never spoke. No name. No date. Just the ink. Faded but never gone. Years passed, and still his trail lingered. Not in monuments, not in statues, but in the hush that followed a meaningful silence. In the way lanterns flickered near doorways. In how people paused by rivers as if waiting for something they could not name. Some say the quill still holds a final word. That if someone brave and still enough were to hold it again, it might stir, might write, might remember. But most do not test it. They simply leave it where it rests, feather and bottle side by side, as if they too are listening. Because a story does not need to be told aloud to be heard. It does not need to be written in gold or carved in stone. The strongest tales are carried in breath and in memory, in wind and in wonder. And as long as someone hums the tune he once forgot, as long as ink once drawn from silence still whispers in the minds of those who never met him, then the bard is not gone. He is merely somewhere else. And the story, well, the ink may fade, but not the story. And so, dear listener, if this quiet journey has rested gently on your thoughts tonight, if the silver quill stirred something soft within you, or the bard's forgotten tune lingered in your mind, then you have truly heard the story. There are many more tales still waiting in the shadows of history, wrapped in whispers and softened by time. Sparkles, like and subscribe to Drowsy Archives for the next chapter in our sleepy wander through forgotten worlds. Until then, may your dreams be filled with gentle echoes and songs yet to be sung.